So gender bias is actually the first topic in this new chapter of ours. You can see that it falls underneath the gender and culture and psychology subchapter, of which cultural bias is the other type of bias we'll be talking about. So before we jump in, we should clarify what a bias is in the first place. So a bias is a tendency to lean towards a personal view that doesn't reflect reality. What does that mean? Well, humans can't help but actually see the world in a biased way. That's just how our brains work. So for example, say you meet somebody new and they come across really arrogant. And later on you find out they aren't actually arrogant at all. And so your initial impression of them was wrong. And that is an example where you held a bias towards somebody, and that later, through gathering more data by meeting that person, you found out that was actually not true, right? And so we can apply the bias to different areas. So for example, when we talk about a gender bias, we're obviously talking about a bias towards gender. So that might be seeing a difference and or similarity between genders that are not there, okay? Here's an example. Men are more intelligent than women, which is not true, but it is a bias that relates to gender. We'll be talking about 3 types of gender bias: alpha bias, beta bias, and androcentrism. Now, before we continue, let's look at an example from social influence. As you may recall, Ash's conformity experiment asked participants to determine which of these 3 lines has the same length as this line labeled X. In this experiment, the researchers used 123 American male undergraduates. Now, what we can say is that whatever result comes out of this, we cannot apply these results to females. We cannot assume that females will behave in the same way, or else we will be committing a gender bias, assuming that men and women behave in the same way. Okay? Now, do women conform more or less in this, or in the same amount? If we were to assume that women have the same level of conformity, then we may have a bias that is different from reality. Yeah? So that is a very good example of a typical gender bias. So let's look at those 3 gender biases in more detail. The alpha bias refers to an exaggeration of gender differences, saying that actually 2 genders are different while there really aren't. The beta bias refers to an underestimation of gender differences, which means that we don't see a difference that actually is there. And androcentrism refers to equating male behavior to normal behavior, right? So let's have some examples for each of these. So an example for an alpha bias is a study from 1968 that looked at the strength of a bond between a mother and her child. And the author argued that girls have a stronger bond to their mother because they have the same biology, whereas boys have a weaker bond because they have different type of biology. And that proved to be wrong. Okay, so in this example, the difference in bond between the mother and the child was exaggerated based on gender. Okay, let's look at a beta bias. Remember when we talked about fight or flight responses, that when you are under a threat, then you can either fight the threat or you can run away from it. Now, women tend to actually react differently. It's called the tend and befriend strategy, right? And it was assumed that women would behave in the same way as men were in the experiments, but in fact, women tend to prefer to mitigate a threat by actually befriending the threat or taking care of the threat. So imagine being in a village in ancient times, maybe 10,000 years ago, and there is a raid or somebody attacking the village. There's aggressive behavior. And women then have to make sure that the children, for example, are safe. And it would make sense then to appease, to calm down aggressive players in order to make sure that nobody dies, right? And so that is a very interesting example of how differences between genders are there, but we assumed that actually both genders would react to a threat in the same way. Let's look at androcentrism. So in androcentrism, there's a great example that is still a problem today. It's called the premenstrual syndrome, which refers to this idea that when women are angry, it is due to hormonal changes. And that is then medicalized. It's seen as something unnatural, something that is sick or simply not healthy. Okay, and when men are healthy, then it's seen as a normal response to a stimulus. Okay, that is obviously wrong, and it is assuming, right, that men's reaction of anger is a normal response while women's response is unnatural. So it is obviously important to know about these issues because, after all, 50% of the population is female, and we should care about how we make them feel by how we treat them. Okay, so let's look at some evaluation. Okay, so there's a study by Maccabee and Jacqueline. So their study found in 1974, their study found that girls have superior verbal abilities and boys have better spatial abilities. That's why I included this picture here of two boys helping the girl with the map. Right? So they argue that this difference is hardwired into their brains. So saying that men and women have different kinds of brains that allow them to either be really good at spatial abilities or have superior verbal abilities. Yeah? And so there was a study in 2015 that looked at that study and found no differences between boys and girls when performing verbal and spatial tasks in a brain scanner. So they looked at the brains and said, nope, there is absolutely no difference between the brains of a man and a woman when it comes to these tasks. Okay? The question here is this an alpha bias, a beta bias, or androcentrism? You can stop the video here and have a think. And the answer is it's an alpha bias because the differences between boys and girls was exaggerated. Okay, there are no differences. They were exaggerated. Alpha bias. Wonderful. But there's a counterpoint that we have to keep in mind. Warning. So this does not mean, right, that we should stop looking for differences between genders because they really do exist. For example, in this study of a researcher whose name I will not try to pronounce, women seem to be better at multitasking, which may have something to do with the fact that the two hemispheres of the brain are better interconnected in women than in men. So the corpus callosum is a part of the brain that connects the both brain hemispheres, and it's more pronounced and has more connections in women than in men, and that might allow them to be better at multitasking. Right? And so there are differences in brain structure that allow women and men to be different from one another. Okay, but we have to take each example, each skill, treat it separately and not generalize across all differences and say that's all an alpha bias. There are no differences between men and women. Okay, so let's look at a practical side of all this. Sexism refers to having unfair treatment of one gender over the other. A study by Murphy in 2014 found that more men are actually psychology lecturers. And psychology lecturers, what do? They conduct experiments. And when they conduct experiments, they might treat female participants of the study in an unfair manner or may disadvantage them in some way. So Nicholson, this is an earlier study from 1995, said a male researcher might treat female participants unfairly, perceive them as unreasonable, irrational, and or unable to complete complex tasks. Okay. Now that means that the treatment of participants is different depending on the gender. What does this mean? It doesn't mean, right, that male lecturers are somehow misogynistic and do this on purpose. Maybe they do, some of them, but I would generally say that they might do this unknowingly. Okay? Slight changes in your behavior if you're confronted with the opposite sex. That is rather what I would say is the conclusion to be drawn here. Okay? Oftentimes we are not even aware how we are treating individuals of the opposite gender differently. Right? You can think of examples where you'd say, yeah, I totally see that. I treat my female friends different from my male friends. Right? And so similarly, those differences can be translated into the laboratory setting where a male researcher might treat female participants differently than males, and that might affect the outcome of the study. Let's look at how researchers are actually dealing with gender bias. This researcher right here looked at 1,000 articles relating to gender bias. Okay, there were 1,000 articles that had something to do with gender bias. And the question was, how likely was it that these research articles were published in journals, right? And the finding was that research on gender bias is funded less often and is published in less prestigious journals. Okay, so the topic of gender bias is not as interesting to the researcher, to the journals, and is not worth so much money in terms of funding to the research community as it should. Okay? And the consequence is that fewer researchers become aware of this issue and continue conducting gender-biased research, right? These researchers are reading these journals, and if these journals don't contain any research on gender bias, well, then they're not going to improve their practice because they are also conducting experiments, right? So they're going to continue making the same mistakes. If they don't learn about this gender bias research issue, then how are they supposed to improve themselves? They are unknowingly doing mistakes, maybe, in their research, and they have no way of knowing because these findings are not being published in prestigious journals. Okay? So that is a problem in research right now, that it's just kept under the rug. On a more practical note, let's look at the implications of gender bias in the real world. If I, for example, have a false assumption about females, their behavior, their emotions, or their cognition, that might form a negative stereotype, and I might start discriminating against women. And that discrimination might lead to disadvantages in the workplace and or wider society. Let's have an example. If I think that women are less intelligent than men, then this stereotype might discriminate them in such a way that they might not get a job. Very practical example of how this research is highly significant for the well-being of women in society. Here's another example. Research on men defines what normal is, and therefore women feel abnormal because they don't fit into the normal category, right? Think of the anger example in androcentrism. If men's anger response is seen as normal and women's response is seen as hormonal, right? Then women feel abnormal every time they are angry. So you see, this is quite the significant research. It has massive implications for how we treat 50% of the population, right? This is a book recommendation I'd like to make. It's called Invisible Women, and it explains how gender biases have created a world that disadvantages women. Here's the table of contents, but basically it talks about biases towards women that disadvantage them in the workplace, in the medicine by going to the doctor, and public life, and many other topics. It's fascinating, really, and I think not just women should read it, but men as well, because men will also be holding positions of power and have an impact on the lives of women. And so that's why everyone actually should be reading this book. In case you're interested, I'm going to put this link in the description below. This is an interesting video that looks at women in science and different issues that women have to deal with, especially in science. So you can watch the video in class and then discuss it with your teacher if you like. So that's it for today. If you'd like to download these slides, you can find them following the link in the video description below. If you are a teacher and you'd like to quiz your students on this content, you can sign up for free on ZenTeach and use our quizzing tool. Consider donating, following us on Twitter and YouTube, and definitely subscribe to get all the latest YouTube videos. The next lesson will be on obedience.